Good morning. It's great to be with you and to be able to share with you. Let's read together from Philippians, as we've been doing now for several weeks. And we're going to continue reading in chapter 1, and we're going to read from verse 12. Now I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel. As a result, it has become clear throughout the whole palace guard and to everyone else that I'm in chains for Christ. And because of my chains, most of the brothers and sisters have become confident in the Lord and dare all the more to proclaim the gospel without fear. It is true that some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry, but others out of goodwill. The latter do so out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defence of the gospel. The former preach the Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing that they can stir up trouble for me while I'm in chains. But what does it matter? The important thing is that in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preached. And because of this, I rejoice. Yes, and I will continue to rejoice, for I know that through your prayers and God's provision of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, what has happened to me will turn out for my deliverance. It's our prayer that God will speak to us through these words this morning. So we're continuing with our series, Joy for the Journey, and this morning we come to a fruitful journey against all odds. So as you read that passage, perhaps you, like me, when you read it, going along quite nicely, and then, you what? What is that about? Well, if the passage pulled you up sharply with a huh, you're not alone. A bit of Google research, and I find that this passage, or at least part of it, is included on a website under difficult Bible passages. So it's a special privilege to be preaching on these verses this morning. Paul, after his encouraging opening words to the Philippians that we've looked at over these last few weeks, now turns to talk about himself and his current situation. Although he has surprisingly little to say about himself even as he does so. What becomes clear is that he is certainly not somebody sending a picture postcard to his friends from the seaside. His situation is a very difficult one. And he begins this section we just read with these words, I want you to know, brothers and sisters. That expression is one of Paul's ways of saying, you need to get this. This is important. Listen carefully. It's time to pay attention. There's an important lesson to learn or point to grasp. He addresses his words to brothers and sisters, family, his family, family for each other. He continues, what has happened to me? These words that he shares are words born out of testimony. So far in his letter, Paul has not directly mentioned what his situation is, although of course Mark has reminded us of it time and again, particularly last week. But now as we read the letter itself, everything becomes clear, although there has been a bit of a hint earlier on in the letter. A little while ago I bought my wife Bev the upstairs downstairs box set. And now as the nights draw in, we're starting to work our way through it. For those who don't know, this was the Downton Abbey of the 1970s. Family upstairs, servants living down below. You know the idea. I have to say the upstairs life is not quite as grand as with the Grantham clan, but you get the idea. One episode starts with everybody in the house dressed in black, in mourning. We haven't seen a death occur, But at the end of the previous episode, we're given a very subtle hint as to what is about to happen. Lady Marjorie Bellamy is off on a sea voyage to see her daughter and granddaughter in the USA. Very little detail is shared about what her trip is going to be. It's only when her husband, the MP, the Honourable Richard Bellamy, decides to send her a good news telegram that we suspect all that may not be well. It's cleverly done. A telegram, please, to Lady Marjorie Bellamy, White Star Line, RMS Titanic. Inevitably, the start of the next episode is sombre, above and below stairs. And for us, as we read, even if we haven't been listening to Mark, we get the hint in the earlier verses in verse 7. Just 2 weeks ago, Mark was looking at verse 6 and Paul's confidence that, to paraphrase the question master in Mastermind, God had started and so he would finish his work in the lives of the Philippians. In the following verse, he went on to say, whether I'm in chains or defending and confirming the gospel, all of you share in God's grace with me. We realise now that Paul has not just been talking hypothetically, but in fact he is wearing real chains. It's not good, surely, that Paul is writing from prison. For someone so involved in spreading the good news of Jesus throughout the world, this was surely a disaster, a huge setback. And yet Paul says this is not a negative thing. This is a very positive thing that God is doing, and even through this, the gospel is spreading. What has happened to me is actually serving to advance the gospel, confounding all expectations. Most Bible experts place Paul at this time as being in Rome, a place he had always longed to go to preach the gospel. But the situation he finds himself in is not the one he would have envisaged. The book of Acts, if we read it, ends with Paul in Rome, in a prison of sorts. It's perhaps not the sort of prison as you and I would imagine it. At the end of Acts 28, it reads, for 2 whole years, Paul stayed there in his own rented house and welcomed all who came to see him. He proclaimed the kingdom of God and taught about the Lord Jesus Christ with all boldness and without hindrance. You see, Paul is not rotting in some Italian jail. He's actually in his own rented house in Rome, and he's preaching the gospel boldly, and yet he isn't a free man. He's a prisoner in his own home, chained, attached almost certainly to Roman soldiers working in shifts. Paul is a captive. He's under constant surveillance. And yet he also realises that he has a captive audience. I wonder if you could ever have possibly imagined being a prisoner in your own home, unable to leave your house for weeks or months, unable to go to church, to visit family and friends, unable to work. Perhaps not before, but how many times have we heard people recently say that they are under virtual house arrest? The difference for Paul is that he is at least allowed visitors, unlimited visitors, but he himself is severely limited. But Paul isn't like me. If I was talking about what has happened to me over the past months, it would be a lament about myself. Disruption to work, the stresses and strains of managing a business, being unable to see family when I wanted to, deprived of my church life and visiting the churches where I preach, holidays cancelled, concerts postponed, work then busier than ever. I have already said that I will not be writing this year's family Christmas letter. There is nothing to report. But when Paul talks about what has happened to him, he has nothing but positive things to say. His chains are a good thing. Paul makes it clear, everybody knows that he is in chains because of Christ. He's not there through some accident or some worldwide pandemic. This is the price, the result of his preaching. I wonder if our own experiences of imprisonment in our own homes help us in any way to appreciate that for many of our brothers and sisters around the world, our temporary experience is their permanent reality. Imprisoned because of their faith, even facing violence and death, or not daring to leave their homes for fear of persecution. What do we really know of the suffering for our faith in Jesus? In Hebrews, we're reminded to continue to remember those in prison, as if you were with them in prison, and those who are ill-treated, as if you yourselves were suffering. Paul knows it, but he's not talking about his prison. Some would even go as far as to say that when Paul talks about what has happened to him, he's not just talking about being a prisoner in his own home. He's talking about the series of events that have led him to where he now is. From Acts chapter 21 onwards, where Paul has been warned about what awaits him and is arrested. He faces a howling mob and doesn't miss the opportunity to share his story. He appears before the Sanhedrin. There's a plot to kill him, a series of trials, an appeal to Caesar, which would then lead him to Rome. A storm, a shipwreck, and throughout, Paul maintains his testimony. Everything that has happened to me, he says, has actually served to advance the gospel. Talk about positive thinking. Of course, the Philippians shouldn't have been surprised, should they, that God would still be at work, even with his people in prison. Remember the early days of Paul and Silas and the Philippian jailer. The people of Philippi originally had not been happy for the arrival of these travelling preachers of this new religion. They complained to the authorities, and we read in Acts that they were severely flogged, they were thrown into prison, and the jailer was commanded to guard them carefully. And when he received these orders, he put them in the inner cell and fastened their feet in the stocks. And it was through their witness and their miraculous release from prison that God's miraculous intervention came, and the jailer finds for himself salvation in Jesus. And so as the letter is now read out, perhaps the jailer and his family are there listening along with Lydia and the young girl who had once earned her master a packet by telling fortunes. They knew from the history of their church that Paul in prison was still an effective witness to Jesus. And the chains Paul is now in are chains of encouragement. Seeing what has happened to Paul doesn't seem to put his fellow believers off in their witness. We are told most of the brothers and sisters have grown in confidence in the Lord. Persecution producing boldness. How easily are we put off from sharing the gospel when things get a little bit tricky for us? Paul's total commitment to the gospel and even his imprisonment is an encouragement to many other believers mobilised to share the gospel. I wonder, are we inspired when we see others who are prepared to risk everything for their faith? Paul is not so much looking at his chains, but looking at the effect of those chains. and not even the effect upon him, but the effect upon others. What an example of joy in the midst of suffering. In saying all that, I don't want to be simplistic, that we compare our lockdown situation with that of Paul. We shouldn't underestimate the mental toll that the current situation has had and will have for so many. These things need to be taken seriously, and our support practically and in prayer is so very important. But then chapter 1 of Philippians turns complicated. So far so good, so positive. It's great. Paul is in prison, but he's preaching and he's rejoicing. And other Christians are inspired by his example, and they're preaching too. And the good news of Jesus is spreading. But there are other preachers at work as well. It's as if there are two sides. Paul goes on. It is true that some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry, but others out of goodwill. The latter do so out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defence of the gospel. The former preach Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing that they can stir up trouble for me while I am in chains. Two groups of preachers, one good, one bad. Who are these rivals? Who are these envious, selfish preachers, these troublemakers? This is the difficult bit. And the learned answer appears to be, we don't know who they are. Are they Christians at all? To get some help, we can contrast Paul's words here with those that he wrote in his letter to the Galatian church. To them he says, but even if we or an angel from heaven should preach a gospel other than the one we preach to you, let them be under God's curse. As we have already said, so now I say again, if anyone is preaching to you a gospel other than what you accepted, let them be under God's curse. Strong words. You see, in the Galatians, we hear about people who are preaching another gospel, a false message. But that doesn't seem to be the case here in the Philippian letter. It's not the message that's the problem. The message seems to be great, but it's the motivation that is the problem. That's where the difference lies. Paul speaks of two groups of preachers and shrugs his shoulders with a big whatever. Christ is being preached by both groups. Rejoice. What we have to conclude is that while in Galatia there was a problem with the message of the teachers, here Paul has no qualm with what is being said from the pulpit, but it's about motive. It's a reminder to all of us that we can never quite be sure of the purity of our own motives. We can look and we can sound good, but actually doing things for the wrong reasons. Perhaps we hope for a bit of recognition. There's someone we want to impress. Perhaps we're even trying to earn God's approval. But the motivation of these preachers is actually to cause trouble for Paul. It's difficult to imagine, for example, a situation where another Christian is preaching the gospel with the motivation of causing trouble for Mark Oliver, or for you, or me. So how could this look for us? Where could we be rejoicing where we'd rather take offence? Maybe we see an injustice. It's difficult to avoid the fact that as Christians we are different. And I don't just mean we are strange, though some might say, but we're different from each other. A host of different opinions about many different things. I wonder, do I object to the differences I see? Do I rejoice when the gospel is preached and that preaching is successful? Am I able to rejoice at the successes of that other church, which is awfully old-fashioned, or far too trendy, or has much more financial resource than ours does, or which is too charismatic, or too high church, or has the wrong approach to baptism, or that seems to be in it just for fame and money? Paul seems to be able here to ignore the motive, but rejoice in the message. People are getting to hear about Jesus, whatever, whether the speaker is a fan of Paul or not. As we saw in Galatians, if the message is wrong, that is a very different thing. But Paul is in rejoicing mode and he has no intention of stopping. He says, I will continue to rejoice. What has happened will turn out for my deliverance or my salvation. Chains will bring freedom. There are two things in the final verse that we've read that Paul tells us that he relies on. Firstly, the prayers of God's people. He knew that he was being prayed for. I wonder, are we praying for those who are in prison, literally, or in a COVID self-isolation prison? As Mark reminded us last week, are we praying big prayers for one another? And secondly, Paul relies upon God's provision of the Spirit of Jesus Christ. Paul looks to his fellow Christians, but also to the resources that God will provide. It's one of those great rapid verses there which encapsulates the whole of the Trinity of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Paul recognises that wherever he is and however limited he is, that God is there for him. As Paul hears elsewhere from God, my grace is sufficient for you. That is all he needs. For Paul, ultimately, there wouldn't be a physical release from prison, not as he might have liked. His preaching would end up costing him his life. But God's grace was sufficient for him. Is that true for you and for me? I wonder, as you face this month ahead, do you take courage from the fact that you are part of a family that is at prayer for one another, that is there for you, remembering you? Do you find that in all this, God is there for you, supplying your needs? That, I think, is a challenge for all of us, isn't it? Or perhaps you're watching and you can't even see how God is relevant to your life, how he fits in with any of this. You don't see any good news for you in this Jesus. Perhaps again, as so much of what is normal life for us is stripped away from you, it'll be a good opportunity for you to consider that there is true joy to be found in Jesus. Reminded again this morning that there is joy in any and every situation, and we can know that through Jesus.